Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I haven't been in a lecture theatre like this. Well, they don't have ones like this in Australia. They're all probably a fair bit newer. So, thank you, Hannah, for the opportunity. I met Hannah at a meeting in November last year, and we sort of had the idea that somehow I might end up in Europe and have a chance to talk to people in Ireland about natural capital and the stuff that I've been working on. So my background, I think, as Jane introduced, is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the National Accounts. So my background is measuring GDP, productivity, balance sheets, these types of things from a very economic perspective. But 8 years ago, I got the opportunity to start working with the United Nations on how we might think about integrating the environment into things. So my ecological knowledge is now thin, but it's existent. I didn't have any, really, if I went back 8 years ago. So I've sort of got enough to be dangerous now, but still learning quite a lot as I go along. So we'll try and give you a bit of a sense of where the SEEA has come from. Hannah's given you a great introduction to sort of the concepts and the setting for this, for why natural capital accounting might be a relevant thing. And so I'll try and give you a background from where SEEA is coming from, and hopefully give you a bit of a link to the National Planning Framework, which you may or may not be familiar with, and I've just had a close look, overview of it over the last couple of weeks, and then give you a sense of where things are up to in terms of implementing the SEEA. So to try and tell the story, this is a little bit of a potted history. It starts, so the SEEA itself, the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, emerges from the system of national accounts. So the way of looking at the economy, which was developed in the 1930s originally, the guy on your left there is Simon Kuznets, quite a famous economist who developed this in the 1930s for the US Bureau of Commerce. And there's the latest version of the System of National Accounts is 2008. But right from the start, it was recognised that the measurement of GDP was not a complete measure. It was useful for some things, but not everything. There's a fairly landmark speech by John Kennedy in about 1967, where he, paraphrasing a bit, that GDP measures everything except the stuff that we value. And one of those was natural capital, but it was also social aspects that are missed in GDP. So the idea that GDP may not be a great measure of things, and particularly a measure of welfare and progress, it's not a recent idea. It's sort of culminated a little bit. There's sort of various waves of this discussion that have gone on, but one of the big ones was in the late 80s. The Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, which came out in 1987, and that was the sort of the benchmark definition of sustainable development, came through there. And one of the things that led to was the Rio Summit of 1992. And they were looking, one of the requests out of that summit was for statisticians to go away and think about extended measures of GDP. And statisticians had been thinking about it a little bit before then, and they released a book early in, it was in 1993, to show how you could take a measure of GDP from a system of national accounts perspective and adjust it for environmental degradation. But it wasn't a standard. People had different views about how it could work out. So it never really progressed too far. There were a lot of things that were done in the context of the SEEA, which I think Jerry will give you quite a good overview of what's happened in Ireland in that context. But it was still not a core statistical activity by any stretch. So in the meantime, our natural capital is sort of disappearing in various ways, shapes and forms. And a landmark report, this one here, called Ecosystems and Wellbeing, was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was released in 2005. So it's a global study on ecosystems, how they're going in terms of condition, their health, the ecosystem services. And it started a whole range of stuff around ecosystem services and moving things. It fed into the Rio Plus 20 in 2012, but it also motivated in part, although it was sort of slightly different, after 20 years from the initial work in the statistical community all agreed that they should do something about taking forward this accounting approach and extending the national account. So these are these two documents up the top here. That's the SEEA, the blue one and the green one. They work together as a pair that I'll describe in a little bit more detail shortly. They came out in 2012. It was about a 5-year process of talking to people. But then there's other things. So there's a program run by the World Bank called WAVES, or Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services, that started in around 2011, 2012. Now we're trying to roll out natural capital accounting around countries in the world, particularly developing countries. A whole big push on the Sustainable Development Goals, which were announced by the UN in 2015. And then the corporate side, in July 2016, there was a release of a thing called the Natural Capital Protocol, which Hannah just referred to, the definition of natural capital there. So there's a whole range of things which are sort of starting to come together and being motivated. So what I'm going to tell you about now is more coming from a statistical point of view, but I hopefully by the end will give you a sense of how these sort of different pieces of the puzzle are actually coming together to try and work jointly towards this type of ambition of a world in which you've got natural capital, ecosystem goods and services being valued / recognised, as values often cause a bit of an issue, protected and restored. So, okay, so there are 4 different types of environmental economic account, IDEEA. The CEA framework covers all of these different types. The blue book, which you might have seen, is called the Central Framework, covers accounting for environmental flows, things like flows of water, flows of energy, waste, greenhouse gas emissions, those sorts of physical things, and it does it in a way that allows you to record that information and link it to economic activity so that you can start looking at resource use, mapping that through economic supply chains and those types of things. It's using the same type of information that you would use on water use, energy use that are generally measured, but it organises that information and defines it in such a way that you can use it seamlessly with the standard economic data. Okay? So it's not collecting new data, it's integrating existing information. Natural resource accounting, which has been around for a number of decades, but sort of formalised in a statistical sense in the CEA, looking at natural resource use of timber, fish, water, soil, minerals, energy resources, and those types of things. In that one, you can look at things in both physical terms, but also in monetary terms, so using net present value of individual resources. Environmental transactions, and that's trying to account for economic or monetary transactions which are already recorded in your standard economic accounts, things like environmental taxes, environmental subsidies, environmental protection expenditure, resource management expenditures, a whole range of things which are identified already in the accounts but which are not sort of identified separately, so you don't necessarily know how much is going on. So the CEA here identifies, well, this is how you should define them, and gives you hints about how you would take it out of the existing accounts to recognise that type of activity. It gets into areas around, say, green jobs, the green economy, how you might define that in a way which is statistically consistent. The last area, which is the one I'm going to focus on, is ecosystem assets and services. So this is a very different and new area from a statistical point of view, but in actual fact it's one way of sort of bringing together a whole lot of information that's out there on land, ecosystem services, the condition of ecosystems, valuation of ecosystem services, sort of all comes together in this way of thinking. Okay, so this is sort of just to give you a sense of the basic way in which the CEA is framing things. These are mainly the flows. We have the environment, which is the large circle, and the economy is understood as sitting within the environment. So that's consistent with that systems picture that Hannah just showed in her last slide, that the economy sits within society, within nature, within the environment. So wanting to try and understand these interactions, dependencies, relationships between these two sort of areas, the environment and the economy. So the dark green circle in the CEA is the economy, and it's measured and defined in the same way as you would define the economy for GDP purposes. There are different ways you could do it, but that's the choice that's been taken. And then we want to start to look at the flows that are coming into the economy. So at the top left there, or it's your left. Top left are natural inputs coming in, and there are residuals that are coming out. We also try and record residuals which stay within the economy, things like solid waste that might be captured and recycled and recovered, so you want to account for all of those flows that are going in and out. And then the sort of more sophisticated next generation way of thinking about it is to see these ecosystem services and how ecosystem services are coming from the environment and ecosystems into the economy. So that's the sort of framing that we're trying to get to. When we go to ecosystem accounting in particular, the model becomes trying to be a parallel for how you'd think about assets, actually any type of asset, whether it was a building, a machine, human capital, all those types of things sort of follow the same sort of logic. But the logic here is the two circles on the left relate to the asset itself. So the idea is to define an ecosystem as an asset, a spatial area, say a forest or a wetland. You might want to choose, to try and get a picture of this in your head, choose one type of thing. For me, it always ends up being a forest, but it works the same way for a wetland or an agricultural area. So you have an asset which will have an extent or a particular size. It will be a very large forest or a very small forest, and it will have a certain condition or quality or health that ecologists have been measuring that sort of stuff for a long time now. There's various methods, not saying they all agree with each other, but nonetheless there's ways of getting to that sense of how healthy that ecosystem is. And from that you get a notion of its capacity. So what is the potential of this asset to deliver ecosystem services and benefits into the future? So it's a really important body of work in the ecosystem accounting to understand the composition of assets, how many forests do we have, deforestation rates, or how much stuff has been converted due to expanding urban areas. These are looking at that composition across the country, seeing how that's changing, and then assessing its health as well and how that's changing over time. But at the same time, and things like biodiversity fits into this notion of asset condition. So the notion of higher levels of biodiversity would be reflective generally, all else being equal, to use an economist's sort of phrasing, would lead you to higher levels of condition. But what we want to get out of that asset and having that asset is a series of services and benefits. We may want it for altruistic reasons. We may think, it's great to just have this asset there, it's fantastic. But ultimately, from an accounting point of view and a natural capital point of view, you need to match both the existence of the asset and how much you've got and the investments you're making in it to restore it or degrade it, with the set of services and benefits that you're getting out of that asset and marrying the two. So the accounting notion is very much so that you've got the stocks notion, but the stock bit is not sufficient. You also need to understand the flows, and that's where the ecosystem services story comes in. What is it that we're getting out of the asset, and who's it flow to? Who are the beneficiaries? Is it purely the farmer or the forester, or are there a range of public services, air filtration, carbon sequestration, water filtration services, that might be amenity services, a whole range of things which might be coming as well that we want to record. So it's attempting to be, the system then is trying to pick up all these different pieces of information which are lying around and bring them together into a sort of a singular framework. In order to do that, to set up these different types of assets, we're really looking at defining things in spatial terms. So most national accounting and a lot of the IDEEA-based work is done at a national level. Ecosystem accounting is done at a spatial level. So you're breaking up a country into different types of ecosystem assets. And this is obviously very stylised, where you have the black line is your so-called ecosystem accounting area. That could be a country, it could be a county, it could be a water catchment, but it's going to be composed of different types of ecosystems within them, whether they're forests, wetlands, agricultural land, grasslands, and each one of those different ecosystem types will be an asset that will have a particular condition and will generate a set of services. So one of the tasks is to go around and break up the world into different ecosystem assets. It's not a task that hasn't been attempted before. There's certainly lots of different ways of doing that, but one of the tasks in the IDEEA is to try and perhaps standardise and harmonise that a little bit. One of the key things is around valuation. You may have noticed that I haven't sort of mentioned a lot about valuation yet. There is a perception sometimes that accounting implies valuation, that in order to do the accounts and to integrate it with the national accounts, you must have a set of valuations in monetary terms. One of the key things of the IDEEA is to try and move beyond that discussion and say that in actual that's not the case. So just a few points on this. I think it's important to understand that accounting principles, stocks and flows, and those types of things are relationships between units that exist. It's not and they're not dependent on monetary relationships. So you have a set of economic units, businesses, households, governments. What we're doing in the IDEEA and in ecosystem accounting particularly is creating another set of units, which are these ecosystem assets, which then have a relationship with, or transact with in accounting terms, the existing economic units, the businesses, the households and the governments. And how we map out that additional set of relationships is really what we're looking for. And you can do that design of the relationships without necessarily saying what the nature of the relationship is in monetary terms. I think it's important to recognise too that measurement in physical or quantitative terms is particularly useful. It's particularly relevant when you're assessing sustainability. Understanding the value of things, if you don't understand the actual stock that's in the ground and how fast you're extracting it in physical terms, leaves you really none the wiser as to what the situation might be. And equally, if you're an economist and you're thinking about changes in welfare, if you focus purely on the value of things, then you're going to be missing the point, really. So just because people are paying €5 a day for a loaf of bread, it's probably quite a lot, but nonetheless, let's imagine that was the case, you're really not worried about whether or not they're paying €5, or keep forgetting which country I'm in, €5 or €6, you're worried about how many loaves of bread they're getting. And so that question of focusing on the physical or the volume notion is fundamental to understanding welfare. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that the answer is not purely in dollars. However, there will be situations where understanding the relative value of different goods and services and different assets is meaningful. So that's the approach we're taking in the IDEEA, that depending on your purpose, doing things in monetary terms will be relevant and helpful, but in a lot of instances it might be completely satisfactory to look at things in physical terms. And indeed, because transactions with the environment actually don't happen, you don't pay money to the environment, your first course of action in measurement terms needs to be in physical terms. You need to understand the physical first before you can get to the valuation in any event. So it's sort of a question of staggering the information. So to sort of quickly summarise, the 4 key features of accounting and the approach. One is that you have accounting for stocks and flows. It's not just focusing on one aspect of things. You're accounting for these units and these entities that exist. So it's not just a generic accounting for things that are out there. It's a very deliberate approach of dividing up the world into a particular way. That does necessarily make it somewhat abstract, and it's somewhat of a compromise. It's not meant to be an ideal portrayal of the system, but it's thought that if we can do that, it might provide information that's useful for decision making at the end of the day. Accounting in physical and monetary terms, which we've just been through, and you've got this notion where we're aligning the boundaries of measuring the economy with measuring the environment, so that we can start to see these things in a systems way. So one of the dangers is that you're measuring the environment here as one system and the economy over here as another system, and we don't sort of get the links together. And what we're trying to do in ecosystem accounting is describe those links in an integrated, almost a single system sort of perspective. I'll probably take up way too much of your time. Anyway, I hope this is helpful. There we go, right. So now I want to sort of focus a little bit on this, I think it was the second point that Hannah made around linking the data to decision making. A couple of thoughts in this space of where accounting fits in. This is what we call an information pyramid. The idea being that accounts sit at that middle level, that you have a whole range of data sets that are out there, and Jerry will give us a good understanding of what's out there in the Irish context. But you use accounting then and the different frameworks and principles to sort of filter that information in a way that can allow you to derive a set of indicators and measurements and metrics that people might look at for performance or reporting or to underpin business decisions. A normal situation, these silos that Hannah referred to, is we have a particular agency, they'll have a particular policy, so they'll decide they'll collect some particular data and they won't necessarily talk to each other. The idea in the IDEEA is that you try and bring all of those different data sets together and tell a more coherent story, and hopefully perhaps a more efficient way of getting data together, so that if you're telling something about land use, for example, it's not that every agency has its own view on land use, that you've got a more integrated sense of what's happening. The idea too, and this is sort of turning the information pyramid 90 degrees, is that you can get all of this data, perhaps classified by different ecosystem types, but it might be environmental data, but it might be economic data related to those particular areas. It might be social data, population, for example, or labour markets. You filter it through these different accounts, and you end up with a set of information that can be used by multiple decision makers. So it's not, it's sort of a create once, use many times type of way of thinking about it, where often in the environmental space, you don't have this integrating coherent type of framework in the middle, and people on this side will just pick information across. and what they want to do for maybe for their particular circumstances. They think, right, this is my question, here I go. How can we sort of try and get this more coherent and what I would call a common environmental history? We've got a really good understanding of our economic history, where the recessions were, where things went up and down, how different sectors played out over time. And everyone basically, all economists basically accept that that's what the story is. On the environmental side, the situation is far more mixed. There's no real sense that I get coming into this information space that there's a common environmental history that people can say, yeah, we all understand this is what's happened in Ireland or in Europe or in Australia. This whole, well, if you go to that paper, you'll find this out, and if someone did it 2 years later and they used a different method and they got a different result and say, well, what do I do with that? So it's easier then for a decision maker to say, well, I'm not really going to bother about it. You experts work out what you want to do and then tell me when you've reached a conclusion. And that conclusion often doesn't come together. So one of the aims of the CEA is to try and bring that all together so that it can fit into this sort of policy and decision-making cycle. So again, this information pyramid now is 3 boxes: basic data, accounts and analysis in this case. I have to credit colleague Michael Varden, who's put this together and spent a lot of work in trying to link together accounts with a policy cycle. Where does it fit in? Could be decision making as well. So you've got your issues, your policy response, you implement it, you monitor it, you review it, and you keep on working around that process. And at every stage in that process, the information base that you have is particularly relevant. So it's not just in designing the policy, it's a particularly big one in terms of monitoring and ongoing monitoring, the effectiveness, performance of policy and decisions that you make. So accounting can have a role to play in all of those points, which I'm hoping links to the National Planning Framework. Obviously I stole a couple of these pictures off the web. One of the things that got me in reading that report that Jane showed just before is that there's a large number of photos of the Irish landscape, as it were, which sort of said whether or not it's the particular outcome that focuses on amenities and heritage, but right through the, 100 and something pages, there are masses of photos of landscapes all through. So and this would happen in every country that was doing something of a similar type. This notion that we're connected and it means something to us is sort of embedded in the way there, but in how we think about it and how we like to view it. But how do we take that sort of gut feel and bring it into the policy and decision-making process? So this is going out to 2040. So these are things that I picked up. It's looking at both urban and rural communities as an idea to try and get both of those within the picture. There's very much an infrastructure and an investment mindset, which for me speaks directly to an accounting setting, that you're looking at your asset that you invest in order to get a set of services and benefits out at the other end. There's a link up front to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're trying to link in that sense the outcomes to this sort of broader international setting. And there's a role as a particular chapter, I think it's chapter 11, at the end, which talks about environmental assessment and the need to, while it doesn't talk specifically about accounting, it does talk about the need for ongoing environmental assessment of all of the different infrastructure and other options that might be developed in the course of implementing the framework. I picked up 3 key environmental themes, one around spatial planning, one around managing resource use, and one around environmental protection. And I wanted to pick up on those. In order to do that, you'll have seen in a few of the slides, we had that box with 4 different quadrants of types of accounts, and this is trying to just tease it out in a bit more detail, and I don't know how much you can read of that, because the lighting on this is sort of a bit odd, isn't it? Probably should have asked for that earlier on, shouldn't I? Good news for you, Jerry. Probably don't. Oh, right. That's the dimmer switch. Right, so these are the environmental flows, and so the types of accounts we get. Sorry, how's that for the recording? Does that work?
Yeah, it's different.
It's different. So the environmental flows, you get things like water accounts, energy accounts, waste accounts, emission accounts, those types of things. Natural resources, and we've been through this, and each of these are different types of accounts. And so the CEA Central Framework and the CEA Ecosystem Accounting identifies these different types of accounts. I wouldn't want you to get the impression that there is one natural capital account. But it is the case that the CEA sees all of these things as being linked. So that if you're doing water accounts in your environmental flows part, that will link directly to your water resource account, and it will link directly to the types of ecosystem services around water that are recorded in another part of the system. So it's collecting information once and using it in different places and in different accounts is part of the way in which it's envisaged. So then what I wanted to do was connect those different types of accounts to the types of things which are sitting in the National Planning Framework. So picking up on these three different themes that I picked up, in total, there are 10 investment outcomes or strategic outcomes that are looking for in the planning framework. Under the sort of general heading of resource use, there's two that seem most relevant. Outcome number 8, which is around sustainable energy, and outcome number 9 around water and a little bit of waste type of stuff. So if I was trying to then link to what sort of accounts might you look at in order to support discussion of that and informing that discussion, I'd be looking at energy, carbon accounts, greenhouse gas emission accounts. And so those types of things are ones which would help support discussion of that outcome. Under water, there's water supply and use tables, water supply and use accounts, resource accounts that tell you how much water you've got, say groundwater versus rivers and lakes, those types of things. Under the topic of environmental protection, there's the whole area of outcome number 7, which is around amenities and heritage, which focuses a little bit more on biodiversity and conservation. And there are accounts that are in the ecosystem suite of things that are looking at issues around biodiversity, ecosystem services, and those types of aspects. And finally, those are sort of the more, if people went to that spatial national planning framework and thought about environment, it's probably 7, 8 and 9, which are the ones I'd really focus on. And it's sort of a bit more obvious that natural capital accounting can work there. What's less obvious, but I think sort of probably more fundamental in moving to this new paradigm of thinking things, are these ones around spatial planning. And there's two in particular, one around compact growth, which is trying to make sure that the urban environments don't spread too far, and outcome number 3 around rural communities and economies. And it's in that space of the ecosystem accounting framing of breaking up the landscape into different units, not just focusing on the national parks, but also focusing on agricultural land and how that intersects with those areas, linking with forestry and urban environments, and putting that all in context, understanding the choices that you might take if you change something from an agricultural land to a forested area. What are the changes in ecosystem services that come about? What are the changes in measured economic activity? So I think there's a real possibility of trying to think about using ecosystem accounting for those two types of investment outcomes, which then means that 5 out of the total of 10 have some link to natural capital accounts. So, I could make the case in my own mind, but then that's sort of my job to make that case. Who buys it is another question. So where are we up to with IDEEA? Final couple of slides from me. This is a map of ecosystem accounting. So people have bought into the idea that there may be something about measuring these ecosystem assets, the condition that they're in, and measurement of ecosystem services. So I've highlighted in dark green countries which have programs of work which are ongoing. It's fair to say that all of them go about things in sort of different ways, or different methods being used and focusing on different parts of that stock flow equation. Some focusing more on assets, some focusing more on the ecosystem services, but all trying to do it, in a sense, sitting within this IDEEA framework that's been described. You'll notice within Europe there's sort of this lighter green colour, if your eyes are good, and that's because there's an EU-wide project run by Eurostat and the Environment Area and the Joint Research Centre in Italy are working together to try and create a set of ecosystem accounts for all the countries within Europe. So in that sense, it's spatially broad, and that's a project that's ongoing. But I think you can see, there's some really significant countries that are buying into the idea. It is early days, but at the same time, it's all coming together in a sort of really positive way. And if you went more broadly to look at those other accounts of the IDEEA, the energy, the water, environmental protection, natural resource accounts, we're getting up towards about 100 countries, 90 to 100 countries, which have either programs of work in place or are commencing programs of work within the next 1 to 2 years. So we're really hopeful it can keep on growing. And the other link that we're trying to make is then into the corporate sector. So to what extent can we use this core accounting model and ecosystem accounting and the way in which we think about the IDEEA to link to the way in which corporates are starting to think about it, which is through the Natural Capital Protocol. The Natural Capital Protocol is not really a set of accounting standards or specific measurement guidance, but it's a process by which a company can engage in the question of natural capital. So you think about framing the discussion, what is my relationship as a company to natural capital? Scope, then if I want to think, yep, okay, I'm good, how do I scope a study to think about that? How would I then measure and value the various components of natural capital? And then how would I think of applying it and reporting on that? So it guides you through a series of steps. Somewhere in the order of 40,000 companies around the world have downloaded the Natural Capital Protocol and had a look at it. There are a large number who are testing it, and it's starting to get quite a lot of traction in the whole natural capital process. And it's over the last couple of years we've started trying to link the IDEEA and the natural capital stuff happening in the corporate space to see how we can, what we call combine forces to take this work forward. So I think in an Irish context, from what I can pick up from Hannah mainly, but also a couple of discussions in the last day or so, there is an opportunity here in the Irish context to be able to take some companies who are thinking about this sort of work, some stuff from the CSO, which is thinking about this sort of work as well, and seeing how there might be sort of synergies and benefits from working together, working collectively on doing it. It's certainly true that no one can do this alone. It's just impossible. So you need to collaborate, you need to work together, and so any opportunities there are to try and find out that sort of thing are just fantastic. So congratulations on all turning up, and happy to answer any questions, perhaps some quick ones now, and then any big ones we'll hold till later. Thank you.
How do you see natural capital accounting applying to, say, a local authority in terms of their spatial planning work, practically in terms of influencing decision making?
Yeah, so I think the start would be, I would go, the logic that I would apply it through would be to find the edge of your local authority. That would be my sort of, sort of ecosystem accounting area, mapping that out in terms of what are the different ecosystem types. And that could be done, I mean, we are developing classifications of that, which would be developed at the UN level, but there's no reason why, and in the work we've done with a couple of corporates, we've sort of used the types of breakups and classifications that are relevant at that scale. So the classification you use is not the critical question. It's once you've got a classification, then you break up your area into those, and then start thinking through what are the ranges of services that are coming from that. While the focus in ecosystem accounting is very much on ecosystem services, and you can do hydrological modelling and carbon modelling and a whole range of things to pick up those sort of more environmental services, as it were, part of the logic of the framework allows you to then add in additional services that might be there, that may be social services or other things that you're then allocating within the landscape. And so the question in a sense becomes, or the application becomes, if you're making a decision about how you're going to use any particular area of land, you're making a decision based on a more complete set of information about what the particular uses of that would be. And if you decide to sort of shift it from, or put a road through a particular area, for example, you can make a judgment on an ongoing basis about whether or not you're losing ecosystem services as a result of that, and then say, well, is that worth that or not? That sort of stuff can already be done in terms of environmental cost-benefit analysis, but what the aim here with an accounting setting is to say, well, don't just do them as one-off studies when you've done a road or you're doing a housing development or something. How can you have an ongoing monitoring sort of framework that leads so that your interest in measuring ecosystem services is not just a one-off, but it's sort of embedded in the way you're thinking about the planning exercise. So that natural capital becomes that sort of normal space. Normally you would think of that, but you'd also think of other bits as well.
I'm curious to know how you get the balance between environmental services and ecosystem services. If you take an area such as, say, catchment, and might be intensive agriculture, so to produce tweed or single species grassland, producing an important service, you could say, in regard to food and economic value. Some ecosystem services, but limited because of biodiversity is low. And in other areas, then will have biodiversity, but very little in terms of service.
I think, so in part this question goes to the question of the role of accounting and statistics more generally in a way. And the idea being that you're trying to not make a choice, in a sense, or make the decision on behalf of the land manager, but you're trying to provide a set of information about what has happened in the past. So for a farming area that was low biodiversity, relatively low on some ecosystem services, but was producing sort of agricultural food, that's the set of services you would record for that particular ecosystem asset. And you record them over time and show potentially how that, the condition of that was changing, perhaps loss of soil fertility from overgrazing, or you had some lowered biodiversity. So you'd make this connection between the set of, you're basically telling that a history for that particular area. And then you've got another history which is being developed for a high biodiversity area. And then as a decision maker, you can look at these two pieces of information in a more, sort of that you've got this history of information and then trying to tell a story. The accounting's not giving you the answer, but it's trying to just, for each of them, use the same framework and hence allow you to do the comparison more meaningfully. Rather than doing one study by one person over here, one study by another person over here, using different frameworks and concepts of benefits, can we have a more harmonised thinking and apply that equally across the landscape?
So if the land cover data, habitat data in Ireland is of mixed, like some places have lots of it, where you don't have a history, how much value does that take out of this system?
The value of it's certainly the case that the value of accounts is increased by having a time series, but the general feeling around the world on this is you just got to start. You've got to start somewhere. So whether your starting point is 2015 and you say we haven't got anything that's good enough beforehand, so we're just going to start here, but at least in 10 years' time we'll have a 10-year time series, then that's a sort of mindset to take into it. I'd also suggest that, and this is the case with measuring the economy as well, it's not the case, most countries will have a 30, 40, 50-year time series of economic data, of GDP. There's generally not a consistent set of information that's underpinned those accounts going back over that length of time. Surveys don't usually run that long. So what the role of the national accountant in that sense in terms of GDP is to create this time series that makes sense from different information sources. So I'd suggest that one option would be, how can you get a group of people to say, well, right, 2015 is our benchmark reference, that's the best thing we've got, and we're going to move forward from here, but let's try and, for want of a better word, make up a story. What's our best expert opinion on how this land has changed over time, and create that time series? Because the thing at the moment is that if you're not, if the experts involved are not creating that time series, then the decision makers are. One of the fallacies of measurement and people involved in statistical measurement and research and those sort of things is imagining that decision makers don't make decisions if the evidence is not there. The revealed sort of situation of the world is that people are happily making decisions about natural capital without the data. So can we somehow inject the expertise that we do know of, however much they might disagree with each other, to make it a situation where decision makers are actually using the best expert advice rather than making decisions in the absence of it? So, yeah. Creating time series is, I think it can be done. Expert opinion is no barrier to progress on accounting. It may not be as high quality, but it's not the end of the world.
Just my understanding of system national accounts is that consumer surplus is measured. So then most of the valuation tools we use in environmental valuation measures mostly consumer surplus. So I'm wondering how do you kind of match up those two to each other?
Now, that could be a long digression.
Sorry.
So we actually had, so I'll do a short answer and then we might stop and then switch over. It's a fundamental question, which we've been tackling now for the last, on and off for the last 4 or 5 years. And we actually had a workshop, the reason I'm in Europe is we had a workshop last week in Germany on precisely this topic to try and engage the economists and the accountants in thinking about things. The short answer is what we can work out now is that there are actually a lot of opportunities to use methods which have been used to estimate consumer surplus, to estimate demand curves, that can then be used to identify what we're calling exchange value. So including stated preference methods. So you don't necessarily have to throw away the method, even if you're not capturing the consumer surplus element of it. You can keep the method, but just apply it in a different way. And it sort of gets to that question that what accountants are asking for, and indeed production economists are asking for, they're just asking a different question from the people who, the sort of more environmental economists who've been measuring changes in consumer surplus. But the actual underlying theory that sits under all of the methods is exactly the same. It's just we're picking different points out of the information set. So that's the short answer.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have a quick question, Susan?
Well, I was just going to ask, I won't delve into that subject, although I'd be interested in finding out the stage of preference, how you're solving that issue.
Yep.
But anyway, I was just wondering, is there a time frame for this in terms of this being, you know, we're in a position where we have national accounts that incorporate ecosystem service values? And sorry, and secondly, I might want to answer this now, but I was just thinking, I think I'm correct in saying that it's assumed that the units, the buyers and the sellers involved in the transaction, are willing participants. And I'm just wondering, is the environment a willing participant? I mean, we're overfishing, for example, and is it a willing participant? So that's a bit more philosophical.
I think we'll park that one. Question on the first one on the expectations. I think it's moving really quite quickly. I think we're short of saying that in the next 2 or 3 years we'll have lots of countries doing adjusted measures of GDP. I think that's unlikely in the next 2 or 3 years. The potential, where we're working at the moment, is the potential to develop reasonably robust data sets that work through this sort of framework, that bring together all of the different types of information that we can find, and have a more harmonised set of definitions and concepts and language terminology that we're using. And I'm pretty confident that within the next 2 or 3 years, and we've got a process that's just starting at the moment to really bring that together from the original work we did 5 years ago, that sort of sat there, which was really widely discussed with sort of. But yeah, there is a bit to go, but at the same time, along that pathway, there's lots of information we'll develop, which will be useful in its own right. So even if we never end up with a adjusted GDP, just applying this sort of framework and organising information around land and ecosystem assets and condition and service flows, just in and of itself, should be something that's useful for a decision-making purpose. So there's lots of intermediate outputs that I think we can gain. And the first one that'll be the cab off the rank, I think, will be the Netherlands. They're coming to the end of a 3-year project where they'll do the complete model for all of the Netherlands. It's not all published yet, and they're still finishing it off. But they'll be the closest at being able to do it. But then the Netherlands is a little bit of an outlier in the sense of being very small, having an incredibly large amount of data at a very fine resolution, and having a very systematised, integrated program of national accounts and environmental accounts. And those 3 things make it a little bit unique. But the fact that it's possible, the fact that the US is trying it out, I think is just a wonderful sign to think that this actually might be possible. So, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, one short question, Jacob?
Yeah, very short.
Very short.
Leading on from that, actually, have there been any case studies published from different sectors that would be very useful to look at first glance and see how these things actually work?
I wish there was an easy answer to that. We've got... I really have to do a bit more of a stock take of different bits of projects in terms of what's been published. Often I end up in the situation of finding out about projects, but never actually finding out whether or not the stuff's been published. So I'm sort of at the wrong end of the supply chain in that sense. But there have been studies that are sort of increasingly on agriculture and forestry are coming along. And yeah, so I must do a better... stronger answer to that. Some of the stuff which has been done and published is for particular regions, so not so much a sectoral perspective, but a sub-national perspective. So there's some in the Philippines that are quite good. Australia's got a number of case studies. The UK has done a fair bit of work on this. So there are things, and perhaps it's a note in my head that I've got to get a stronger list of examples together. I know where they sort of sit, but I've got to try and get that together.